A grim 24 hours for NATO-led forces in Afghanistan, during which 6 US Marines were killed. The attacks carried out by Afghans trained by and working with ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force. Are these killings part of a strategy? If so, who is behind them? And what impact do they have on long-term security in Afghanistan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. 3 of the US Marines were shot dead by an Afghan worker at an ISAF base in southern Afghanistan. Another 3 US Marines from a Special Forces unit had been killed earlier in the same day in the same area by a uniformed Afghan police officer. These incidents are referred to by NATO as green-on-blue killings, indicating that they carried out by Afghan police and soldiers or individuals wearing the uniforms. The same police and soldiers trained by and supposedly working hand-in-hand with the International Security Assistance Force. This at a time when the NATO-led forces are preparing to leave and hand over security responsibility to the Afghan army and police, the withdrawal process due to be completed within the next 2 years. Let's begin with this report from Tom Ackerman.
The theme of a recent NATO video, cooperation between U.S. and Afghan forces.
Through their close friendship and continued partnership, the people of Afghanistan have brighter days to look forward to.
But that rosy forecast has been clouded by a worrying increase in what the military calls green-on-blue attacks by Afghan military against members of the Western coalition. Through 2008, they happened only once or twice a year, but this year they've been averaging 1 per week. And in just the past week, 6 NATO military died in 3 separate attacks. The toll thus far this year, at least 34 killed compared to 35 for all of 2011. NATO's ISAF command has tried to downplay the attacks, focusing instead on what it calls the Afghan steady progress toward taking over the war against the Taliban by the end of 2014.
The main cause for those incidents were personal grievances. Knowing this, we have still confidence in our Afghan partners, and our troops out there still are willing to work with them. They have the trust that we all are working together for the same objective.
But both the Taliban and many government commanders say the attacks are carried out by Taliban infiltrators. After an Afghan army sergeant killed 2 British soldiers in April, one Afghan general said, quote, "We cannot promise that it will not happen again. It is out of my control." Yet NATO's Secretary General says the Afghans must do more.
They include strengthened screening processes, but also education, both education of Afghan security forces and ISAF troops, with a view to prevent such incidents in the future.
As the exit date for Western combat forces nears, their challenge will be to keep up the training of Afghan fighters amid a climate of growing suspicion. Tom Ackerman, Al Jazeera, Washington.
As we mentioned, international combat troops are due to complete their withdrawal from Afghanistan by the end of 2014. They've been in the country since the US-led invasion in October 2001. By 2003, the US Secretary of Defense claimed that major combat had ended. But a decade later, the number of NATO-led forces had risen to 150,000, with no significant let-up in the level of violence. This figure dropping as the withdrawal process gets underway, but the timetable apparently unaffected by factors like the assassinations of high-profile members of President Karzai's inner circle. And over the past 2 years, there's been an increase in the number of attacks on NATO-led forces by Afghan police and army officers or those wearing their uniform. 21 such attacks took place in 2011, and 25 have been registered so far this year, with 4 months still to go. So has the Afghan army and police been infiltrated by forces opposed to international military intervention, or are there other reasons? To help answer these questions and more, we're joined by our guests. From Washington, D.C., Phyllis Bennis, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and author of Understanding the U.S. War in Afghanistan, a primer. From Kabul, we are joined by Afghan journalist Fahim Dashti head of the Afghan National Journalists Union. And finally, also in Kabul, Brigadier General Gunter Katz of ISAF, who you saw earlier in our report. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with General Katz. What do you believe lies behind these killings?
Good afternoon. What we found out when we looked into those separate incidents, which are very traumatic, and we take them very seriously. What we found out is that most of those cases were caused by personal grievances, by stress, or by battle fatigue. We also hear the claim of the Taliban that they infiltrated the Afghan National Security Forces. However, we cannot confirm this. Again, we looked in those recent incidents of this year, and what we found out was that the infiltration rate actually was in a one-digit number.
Well, Phyllis Bennis in Washington, what's your view of the reasons?
I don't think we know all the reasons for every individual one, but I think that the claim over and over again that we hear each of these events is an isolated incident, not connected to all the others, simply doesn't fly. I'm sorry, General, it just doesn't fly. It may be that every one of those attackers had some personal grievance. That doesn't explain the trends. It doesn't take into account the fact that beyond the Taliban, there is massive opposition throughout Afghanistan to the presence of foreign forces occupying their country. 150,000 foreign troops occupying Afghanistan has engendered massive opposition from a wide range of people, including the Taliban, obviously, but certainly not only the Taliban. So the notion that it's either specific Taliban infiltrators, and clearly the Taliban is not even claiming credit for all of them, including one of the ones yesterday. They said, we didn't do this, we don't know who did. But the claim that somehow if it's not a specific Taliban infiltrator, it's just a personal grievance, I think doesn't fly. I think we have to recognize that there is opposition, massive opposition, to the Taliban, to the U.S. forces. There is also opposition to the Taliban. But the role of occupying forces engenders a very powerful reaction among many people, and it's not surprising that some of that takes a military, a brutal force like this, and turns on the soldiers that are training. You can train soldiers in how to do things better, but you can't train them to be loyal to you or to a government that many Afghans do not consider legitimate.
Well, General, I'll allow you to respond to those specific points in a moment, but let's first go to Fahim Dashti and get your view of why these attacks are happening so widely.
Well, I think both of your guests are right. We are facing two different stories. From one side, we face a massive intelligence war between Taliban, Al-Qaeda, other terrorist groups from one side, and Afghan security forces and NATO forces from other side, in which it seems the Taliban are in the winning side, unfortunately. But from other side, I agree with the general that some of the incidents are based on the personal reason, or based on the personal relation between Afghan security forces and NATO forces. We know that in most cases, NATO forces do not respect their Afghan counterparts. Sometimes even they are insulting the Afghan police or army soldiers. So this is why I think both are right, but the fact is that we need to find a solution for both of the problems.
Well, General Katz, I'd like you to respond first of all to the claim by Phyllis Bennis that there is a trend here in these attacks by uniformed Afghans on NATO-led forces. Do you perceive this as a trend?
Well, first of all, let's have a look at our mandate. Phyllis was claiming we would have occupied this country. This is not part of our mandate, actually. We are here to support the Afghan government in the effort to bring stability and security into this country, and this is what we're actually doing. And I certainly respect Phyllis' first personal opinion. However, we investigated every single incident, and what I told you already is what we found out, that most of those incidents were caused by personal grievances.
Well, if there are indeed personal grievances happening here, then they too must have some kind of wider base, should they not, General?
Well, it's always difficult to generalize things like this. What I can tell you, however, yes, we had 26 very tragic incidents here this year, but we must not forget that while we are speaking, we have almost 500,000 soldiers and policemen, men and women, fighting together for the same objective, and that is bringing peace and stability to this country and to this region. And those 500,000 soldiers and policemen are, I think, a very significant number. And again, 26 incidents are very serious, but compared to the 500,000, I think it's very clear that we cannot generalize that.
Well, Phyllis Bennis, we are talking about massive numbers here. Statistically, the point being made by the General is that the number of incidents is not that significant in relation to the number of people in theatre. What's your view of that?
Well, first of all, I think that in regards to what the General was just saying, it's not a coincidence that the German contingent, for example, one of the largest contingents, the General's own contingent, within the coalition, has not been the target of these kinds of attacks, has not had major numbers of casualties. They have had some, but that has to do with the way they perceive their mandate, which is not that of an occupying force, which unfortunately is not the approach of the United States, which is carrying out night raids and drone attacks and a much more aggressive military occupation than what Germany, for example, is doing. So I think that we can't generalize also from the coalition forces, despite the fact that the General is here today speaking on behalf of NATO and the coalition as a whole. But I think that the question of what gives rise to these attacks has to be looked at in the context of the political situation throughout Afghanistan. We're looking at an arena in which, on the one hand, the U.S. is trying desperately to get negotiations underway with the Taliban, including, for example, releasing high-ranking Taliban prisoners from Bagram Air Base. But Bagram prison still has 3,000 or more prisoners. That's one of the things that has given rise to a huge amount of antagonism among many, many Afghans, some in the military, some among the police, some not, who have families who have been caught up with people arrested and thrown into prison in Bagram, for which they appropriately hold the U.S. military responsible. So I think that that's one of the factors that leads to this. When we speak of personal animosities, I think a lot of those personal anger, the personal responses, has to do with what has happened to their families. If a soldier knows that his family in his village has faced the death of a child in a drone attack that was accidental, they were collateral damage, those excuses don't fly. And they're going to be angry enough in some cases to kill.
Well, let's put
the
that
notion
point,
that we can
if I
separate
may,
this
Phyllis,
out, I don't think.
If I may, Phyllis, let's just put that point to Fahim Dashti. How much of this should be seen in the wider political context within Afghanistan, in the whole nature of what some would claim is a massive political vacuum within that country?
Well, I think, so just let me point out on another issue. If German soldiers have not been targeted by such incidents, it's not only because that the mandate of German forces in Afghanistan is different from US. We have French soldiers in Afghanistan, forces in Afghanistan, which have faced the same kind of incident, but the mandate of French forces are not the same as the US. The fact is, where these forces are located, this is the issue. Most of the American, Canadian, Britain, and some others forces have located are located on the southern part of Afghanistan, which is in fact the war zone. But the German forces are on the north, which is peaceful side. Peaceful part of this country. But if we see to the political scene here in Afghanistan, some efforts which has been run by the Afghan government or NATO or Americans to negotiate with Taliban and to find a peaceful solution for these problems. I think this have been failed, and I believe that this wouldn't go anywhere, and this wouldn't lead us anywhere. The fact is that we are facing an enemy which is which would not be satisfied unless to defeat us. Then means that the only way that we have, the only option that we have, is to defeat them, either by the support of international security forces, or only by Afghan police and army.
Well, Gunter Katz, I'd like you to pick up on that particular point that was made by Fahim Dashti there. That is the regional basis of these attacks. Does ISAF recognize the fact that the attacks are happening in areas that are probably more violent than others, such as these most recent incidents which happened in Helmand province? Is that recognized by ISAF?
Before I address Fahim's comment, let me just correct something that Phyllis was saying. I'm here as the spokesperson of ISAF, and ISAF represents 50 nations, and they all have the same mandate given by the United Nations. And we must not forget that not only the United States of America, but many other nations had huge sacrifices from their fight against the insurgents. And we will not be able to split up those different nations. They are united. We have a unity of effort, clearly. And we share the same goals and the same objectives. I would like to address something else that has been mentioned, that is the hearts and minds of the people here. We got the strong feeling, we got the assessment that after 30 years of civil war, the Afghans don't want to fight anymore. They look for peace, stability. And this is what the Afghan National Security Forces, together with ISAF, will contribute. And the Afghan National Security Forces are in a good way to provide further that stability, and they will be able to take over full responsibility in this country by the end of 2014. And I need to underline that the international community as a whole will stay committed in this country. Afghanistan will never be alone again anymore, and we continue our partners for a long time beyond 2014.
Yeah, those
and
points.
Again,
those points taken, General. Those points, General. But if I may just ask whether within ISAF there's any thought of the possibility that certain of its members come under greater danger of attack than others. Are U.S. forces more liable to attack in the coalition than, for example, German forces?
Well, what I can tell you is, just as an example regarding your question, we have about 70% of the ISAF forces are represented by US soldiers. And if you now just look at our casualty rates in terms of those insider threat incidents we were talking about, 50% of those casualties were US soldiers, again, versus 70 completely in this theater and in this country. So only those numbers clearly show that this claim that the insurgents focus on the United States is wrong.
Well, Fahim Dashti, I just want to go to you with that point that was brought up there by General Katz about hearts and minds, and that ISAF is playing a role in winning the hearts and minds of Afghans who he claims are tired of violence and tired of war, and in some way that this will lead to a better future for Afghanistan. Your view of that?
Oh, I think very unfortunately ISAF and NATO forces, I'm not talking about the international community, I'm talking about the NATO and ISAF forces. They failed to win the hearts and minds of Afghans. They had more than a decade to achieve this goal, and they failed. And I don't think that they could achieve that in 1 or 2 years which left before their withdrawal from Afghanistan. What can they do? to secure the future of Afghanistan, and through that to secure the future of the world from the terrorist attacks and from the widespread activities of the terrorist network, which is based in south of Afghanistan and north of Pakistan, is to strongly support the Afghan security forces, army and police, and to equip them, and to pressurize the Afghan government through their supports to make serious changes on the leadership of the Afghan security forces, because as long as the leadership does not have reasons to fight, or they are not ready to fight, or they are not serious to fight Taliban and Al-Qaeda, how we can expect just an ordinary soldier to have this mindset?
Well, Fahim Dashti, I want to pick up on a point that you made there and pull it to Phyllis Bennis, and that is the mention there of Pakistan. We have ISAF forces as foreign troops within the country. You also have, many would claim, an infusion of outside forces from neighboring Pakistan, for example. Many point fingers at the Haqqani network. But you do have the possibility that what we are looking at here goes far beyond what ordinary Afghan people want. It is in a way becoming a proxy battle between many forces, is it not?
I think it is certainly becoming a proxy battle, and really has since the earliest days of the U.S. invasion in October of 2001. But I also think that one of the things we're seeing is the rise of what we can call a new definition of a militia war within Afghanistan, where essentially the Afghan National Army, the Afghan National Police, the ISAF forces, NATO and the U.S., are being seen increasingly, I think, as just larger versions of militias that are fighting each other. This is a government in Kabul that has very little respect and legitimacy from the people of Afghanistan. You have a people that is not accustomed to having a strong national government determine what happens in the whole country. I mean, they don't call President Karzai the mayor of Kabul for nothing. It's based on the understanding that his brief really only extends to not even all, but certainly parts of Kabul. So the notion that you have, on the one hand, a legitimate national army and respected national police force fighting a hated insurgency is simply not the reality that people on the ground in Afghanistan describe.
Well, let's go at that point, Phyllis. Sorry to interrupt you, but if we go straight to Fahim Dashti, who I see shaking his head and disagreeing with you, why?
If I may represent Afghans as an Afghan, I do believe that Afghans are trusting their security forces, and this idea has been raised on the recent years. This is very understandable that the disagreement between U.S. and President Karzai and his government have made some allegations here or there that President Karzai is a mayor of Kabul or something like that. I'm a strong critic of President Karzai and his government. This is not true. Even though I'm his critic, this is not true. After centuries of dictatorship,
Phyllis Benson wants to get a word in there. Phyllis Bennis wants to get a quick word in there.
I absolutely respect Fahim's judgment here, but I also know other Afghans who see it very differently, including members of the Afghan parliament, who talk about their view of having three major challenges to women and civil society in Afghanistan. Those three being what they call the U.S. occupation, despite the fact that it's international, what they call the warlords disguising themselves as the parliament and the government, and the Taliban. They see all three as challenges they have to overcome.
Well, so on that note of disagreement, we must come to an end to this discussion, I'm afraid. My thanks to our guests, Phyllis Bennis in Washington, and Fahim Dashti and General Gunter Katz in Kabul. Thank you all, and thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.